actions have consequences, and no place is this more prevalent than when there is a large conflict. Well, in today's lesson, we're going to ask ourselves, how did the Crusades affect Europe and the Middle East? Today, it's our goal to learn about the Crusades. And to do that, first we're going to break it down into a couple of more manageable parts. First, we're going to explain why people wanted to pursue control of the Holy Land. Next, we're going to explain the events of the Crusades. And then finally, we're going to describe the effects of the Crusades. But as we move through this lesson, there are some words that you should be familiar with. First, your academic words: assembled, liberate, and nefarious. Then your domain-specific words, words like crusade, heretic, and reconquista. Remember, if you ever have any trouble with any of these words, you can always use your glossary to help you. Our lesson question is, how did the Crusades affect Europe and the Middle East? To answer that question, first we're going to talk about the reasons for the Crusades and how that led to the events of the Crusades, and finally, how the events of the Crusades led to the effects of the Crusades. Before we get started, let's talk about the medieval Catholic Church and how important they were to that society. Well, the Catholic Church helped to unify Europe. After the fall of the Roman Empire, people became isolated and more divided as they moved out of cities and left for more rural areas. The one thing that kept them all together was their shared belief in the Catholic Church. Well, the Catholic Church took on the roles of government after the fall. It also provided a shared faith for people, and it established a common authority. So the church at this time was very important. Let this lesson question guide your thinking as we move through this lesson. The question is, how did the Crusades affect Europe and the Middle East? We talked a little bit about the importance of the Catholic Church at this time, but now we're going to talk about the reasons for the Crusades. In 1093, the Byzantine emperor asked for help to fight Muslim Turks. What was happening was that Christian convoys were traveling to the Holy Land to visit historical relics of their religion. And these Muslim Turks, they were attacking these convoys and preventing them from traveling safely to the Holy Land. So the emperor wrote a letter which eventually was given to Pope Urban II. And the Pope gave a speech in which he called for a crusade. You can see in this picture, the Pope is up here on his platform delivering his speech, inspiring the Crusades. Now, we as historians, this would be a large, momentous event in history that we would want to analyze. And it would be helpful if we could look at the speech directly. But as we evaluate primary resources, there are some things that I want you to keep in mind that we need to do as historians. First, we want to evaluate the perspective. We want to ask questions. We want to ask questions like, when was it written? Who was the author? Why was it written? And what else is happening at this time? We also want to ask questions like, can we trust the validity of what we are reading? Is it really a primary document? Is it the actual speech itself, or is it someone's interpretation of the speech? Let's take a look at an example. Here is an excerpt of the speech, and I want you to ask yourself some things as we read this together. Who's the author? When was it written? What conclusions can we draw about this source? Let's read this together, and then we'll go back and answer some of these questions. This royal city, Jerusalem, desires to be liberated and begs you to come to her aid. God has granted you, above all other nations, great glory in arms. Accordingly, undertake this journey eagerly for the remission of your sins, with the assurance of the reward of imperishable glory in the kingdom of heaven. This is a very empowered speech, but we as historians, remember, let's take a look at this a little closer. This is written by Robert the Monk. It is his account of Pope Urban II's speech. This particular document, when we ask ourselves the next question, when was it written, we don't see a date on it, which would put a red flag in our minds. Now, I can tell you that this speech was written in 1122. But if you remember, that's about 30 years after the Pope gave his original speech. Can we really trust the validity of this document? And what conclusions can we draw about it? Well, this is a monk. He would obviously be in support of whatever the Catholic Church was advertising, which in this case was a crusade. Did he embellish the language? So we need to ask ourselves, as historians, are there other sources that we could rely on? Do we need to compare this to another primary source, or can we trust this document? What were the goals of the Crusades? Well, one, they wanted to liberate or free Jerusalem from Muslim control. They also wanted to stop the spread of Muslim rule. They wanted Christian rule instead. They wanted to recapture lands that had been Christian and bring them back. So here's the Muslim territory over here, and here's Jerusalem. This is that pivotal place that we're talking about. And why is Jerusalem, this Holy Land, so important? Well, it's important to three different groups for three different reasons. It's important to Christians because they believe that this is where Jesus traveled and this is where Jesus was crucified. It's important to Muslims because they believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven from this location. It's also important to the Jewish people because Solomon built his temple here, which is a holy relic in the Jewish faith. So why would one want to join a crusade? Well, people answered the call to a crusade for several different reasons. One was to defend Christendom. If you believed in Christianity, it was your duty to defend it. They wanted to earn money. There was a lot of money involved in going on a crusade. And also they wanted to save their souls. If you remember that segment of that speech that we read together, there was a promise of a remission of sins if you participated in this noble journey of a crusade. Here's your lesson question once again. How did the Crusades affect Europe and the Middle East? Well, we discussed some of the reasons for the Crusades, to save Christendom and to liberate Jerusalem. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the actual events of the Crusades. There were actually several crusades, but for the purposes of this lesson, we're only really going to focus on the First Crusade, the Third Crusade, and the Fourth Crusades. Now, let's talk about the First Crusade from 1095 to 1099. Well, in 1097, an army of tens of thousands of crusaders assembled or gathered in Constantinople. Now, their goal was to seize Jerusalem and to drive out the Muslims. Well, they succeeded, but they were actually forced to defend the city for nearly 100 years because they were surrounded by angry Muslims. Now, in 1187, the Muslim general Saladin did retake the city, and you can see that depicted here. You can see the Crusaders, they're the ones with the red crosses on their backs, and you can see that they are surrendering to Saladin up over here. Now let's talk about the Third Crusade. It was led by King Richard I, or Richard the Lion-Hearted, and King Philip II of France. You can see in this miniature over here, the two of them joining forces to go on their crusade. Now, both men issued taxes on their populations to help raise money for the crusade. They did capture much of the Holy Land, but they failed to capture Jerusalem. Remember, that's the city that everyone was focused on liberating. And the crusade actually ended in a compromise with Saladin. Richard and Philip said, "We agree to see you as the rightful leader of this territory. However, as a compromise, Christians must be guaranteed safe passage to visit the Holy Land and these religious relics." Now let's talk about the Fourth Crusade, which is more financial in nature than anything else. The Fourth Crusade was all about money, and that's really what I want you to remember. As time went on, the goals of the Crusade started to change. The Fourth Crusade was supported by merchants in Venice, wealthy people who owned shops or had trade stores. They wanted to eliminate their commercial rival in Constantinople. So, because of this, support for the Crusades began to decline. What was going on was they actually just wanted to raid Constantinople and hurt the people and damage their trade integrity. The Pope had put out an edict that said that you cannot harm other Christians. But this crusade went into Constantinople and killed Christians anyway because they were trying to eliminate that commercial threat. You can see in this picture the raid going on during the Fourth Crusade. Now, what was the Crusaders' goal? Well, as time went on, the Crusades targeted non-Catholics that were outside of the Holy Land. Crusaders targeted pagans in the Baltics and heretics in France. Remember that the word heretic means someone who believes something that is not recognized by the church, and therefore they see them as a heretic or an enemy of the church. Spain used the Reconquista to take control of its government and to expel its Muslim and Jewish population. The Reconquista was a group of people that would protect them. So keep all these things in mind as you're evaluating the different crusades. Here's your lesson question. How did the Crusades affect Europe and the Middle East? We talked about some of the reasons for the Crusades, wanting to liberate Jerusalem. We also talked about the events of the Crusades, looking at the First, the Third, and the Fourth Crusade, and how some of the reasons behind them began to change to more financial suited needs. Now we're going to take a look at some of the effects of the Crusades and see how violence was starting to be an acceptable way of resolving religious differences. The Crusades demonstrated the power of the papacy and the Catholic Church. Remember, at this time, many people were willing to submit themselves to the church and offer up their men, their money, their supplies, their weapons. And because of all this, the Catholic Church grew very wealthy. Many Europeans became more religious and willing to sacrifice for their faith, even sacrifice themselves or family members. And as a result, millions of people lost their lives. Now, there were also political effects. The power of the feudal nobility began to decline, and the power of the monarchs increased. Because as the nobles were dedicating their time and their money and their resources to fueling the Crusades, they began to lose their money and their lands and their properties started being returned to the kings or the monarchies who had granted them to them in the first place, thereby making the monarchies much more wealthy. As a result of that, feudalism was beginning to decline. Now, one of the most important effects was an increase in trade between Europe and Southwest Asia. Trade did increase during this time brought upon by the Crusades. Europeans brought back goods from Asia, including silks and spices, and it increased demand for these items. Also, banking systems developed to transfer funds for troops and also for more supplies. Trading cities became much more important. And Italian merchants grew wealthy. Remember, the power of the nobility started to go down. And because of this increased economy and this increased trade, the power of the merchants began to go up. And the Italian merchants grew wealthy and transporting goods between Europe and Muslim territories. Now, there were also effects in the Muslim world as well on the other side. There was an increased distrust in Europeans. There's also decreased religious tolerance among Muslims. They saw these crusaders as heretics, infidels, invaders, and there was an increased distrust. It accelerated the decline of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, and it also weakened the Muslim empires, making it more difficult for them to defend against the Mongol invasions of the 1200s. Now, the Mongols would eventually come in and start defeating some of the Muslims, and they would actually destroy their primary city of Baghdad. We can see on a timeline where Pope Urban first called for the Crusades, and then we can see where some of the Crusades were happening, as we talked about in our lesson. We can sort of start to piece together how these events led to a weakening of the Muslim empire, where eventually they left themselves open to the Mongols being able to capture Baghdad.